What if the biggest thing international basketball revealed about Caitlin Clark was not just how dominant she can be, but how different the game looks when officials actually call it the way it is supposed to be called? Because that is where this story really begins. Not with a trophy, not with a highlight, not even with the MVP announcement that sent her name all over the basketball world again. It begins with something far more uncomfortable. A comparison that nobody at the WNBA office should feel good about. One player, two different environments, two completely different realities. And once people saw that difference play out in real time, it became a lot harder to pretend the last 2 years were just random bad breaks, emotional fan reactions, or ordinary missed calls that happen in every league. For a long time, the conversation around Clark has been framed in a very careful way. People were told she needed to adjust, told she needed to get stronger, told the physicality was just part of the pro game, told that what happened to her night after night was normal, and that the outrage around the contact, the grabbing, the hip checks, the hand fighting, and the no calls was mostly overblown because referees are human and the game moves fast. That explanation worked for some people at first, maybe even for a lot of people, but only up to a point. Because once a player steps into a different tournament, under a different whistle, under a different standard of enforcement, and suddenly starts looking even more dangerous, even more efficient, and even more historically productive than before, the entire excuse system starts to fall apart. And that is exactly why this moment feels so much bigger than just one international tournament. Because when Clark stepped onto that floor for Team USA, the difference was immediate. Not subtle. Not something you had to squint to see. Immediate. The game looked cleaner. The contact was called faster. The defenders could not just lean, bump, hold, and recover without consequence. The whistle actually existed. The rule book actually showed up. And all of a sudden, the same player who spent 2 years getting treated like she was supposed to survive chaos without complaint started looking like something much more dangerous than the league had been comfortable admitting. Not just a star. Not just a box office draw. Not just a rookie sensation turned franchise engine. A problem. A structural problem for every narrative that had been built around minimizing what was happening to her. Because if Clark looks one way when defenders are allowed to do almost anything they want, and looks another way when that freedom gets taken away, then the conversation is no longer about whether she can handle professional basketball. The conversation becomes much more serious than that. It becomes about what professional basketball has been allowing to happen around her in the first place. And once that question gets asked honestly, a lot of people start looking very exposed. That is what made this stretch feel so explosive. On the surface, the headlines were simple. Clark returns. Clark dominates. Clark wins MVP. Fans celebrate. Team USA moves forward. International basketball gets its star moment. But underneath that surface, there was a second story unfolding at the exact same time, and that story was far more revealing. Because every clean possession, every whistle on obvious contact, every moment where a defender got penalized for doing what WNBA players have been doing to her for 2 straight seasons without punishment, it all created one brutal question. If this is what happens when the game is officiated properly, then what exactly were people watching before? And that question gets even sharper when you remember how often fans were told there was nothing to see. They were told that complaints about officiating were exaggerated, told that star treatment goes both ways, told that every great player gets hit, told that Clark needed to stop reacting so much, stop talking to refs so much, stop showing frustration so openly. But frustration does not come out of nowhere. It comes from patterns. It comes from repetition. It comes from living inside the same sequence again and again until it becomes impossible not to feel like something is off. A missed call in one game is basketball. A missed call in 10 games is a trend. A missed call over 2 seasons, across different opponents, different arenas, different crews, different moments, and always somehow leaning in the same direction starts to feel like something else entirely. That is why this tournament hit such a nerve. Because it did not just give Clark another stage. It gave the audience a side-by-side comparison that the WNBA never wanted people to have. It gave fans a version of the game where the noise around officiating faded into the background because the referees were not becoming the story. They were just doing their jobs. That alone was enough to make the contrast impossible to ignore. And once that happened, every old clip started looking different. Every no-call started feeling heavier. Every explanation from league leadership started sounding weaker. Every time someone said the issue was overblown, people now had visual evidence of what the alternative looked like. And the alternative was terrifying for anyone who had spent the last 2 years downplaying Clark's situation. Because when you remove the constant clutching, bumping, rerouting, and off-ball contact, you do not just get a slightly improved version of Caitlin Clark. You get a version that bends the floor, speeds up the game, breaks defensive structure, and puts entire teams in crisis. You get a player who does not just make difficult passes, but makes impossible ones look routine. You get a shooter who becomes even more dangerous when defenders cannot crowd her with unchecked contact. You get a ball handler who can actually turn the corner without being mugged in plain sight. You get vision, pace, timing, and control at a level that changes the geometry of the game. And when that version of Clark is allowed to exist, suddenly all the old arguments about her limitations start sounding less like analysis and more like cover. That is the real reason this story matters. Not because one tournament magically proved she is great. People already knew she was great. Not because one MVP suddenly created her value. That value was obvious long before the trophy. And not because international basketball discovered something nobody had seen before. They did not discover it. They simply stopped interfering with it. They let the game breathe. They let the rules function. They let obvious contact be obvious contact. And in doing so, they exposed just how distorted the conversation around Clark had become back in the WNBA. So now the pressure shifts. Because this is no longer just about Clark proving herself. In a lot of ways, that part is over. She has already done too much, too early, under too much pressure, in too many bright moments for that argument to keep surviving. Now the pressure is on the people who kept insisting there was no real officiating issue. The pressure is on the voices who dismissed the tape. The pressure is on the league that kept asking the public to trust its explanations while the evidence kept piling up in the other direction. And most of all, the pressure is on the referees who now have to deal with the fact that fans have seen what the game looks like when Clark is actually protected by the same rules everyone claims already apply. Because once people see that version, they cannot unsee it. They cannot unsee how much smoother the offense looks. They cannot unsee how quickly defenders become less reckless when they know the whistle is real. They cannot unsee how much easier it is for Clark to control tempo when every possession is not a wrestling match disguised as playoff intensity. They cannot unsee the way her confidence expands when the game feels like basketball instead of survival. And they definitely cannot unsee what happens when a player who has been operating under resistance for so long suddenly gets even a little bit of fairness. That is when the whole conversation changes. And maybe that is what makes this so uncomfortable for the wrong people. Because the most damaging thing this tournament revealed was not just that Clark could dominate internationally. It was that the difference between good and historically dangerous might be a whistle. It might be that simple. It might be that the line between a star having a strong season and a star ripping through the sport at an MVP level has been shaped, more than anyone wanted to admit, by what officials chose to ignore. And if that is true, then every future game comes with a new kind of scrutiny. Now people are watching the refs too. Not casually, not as background noise, closely. Because once a pattern has been exposed, every new possession becomes part of a larger argument. Every drive, every bump, every off-ball grab, every no-call, every delayed whistle, every explanation from the league office now lands in a completely different atmosphere. The audience is no longer guessing. They have a reference point. They have seen a version of Clark operating under a cleaner standard. They have seen what happens when defenders are not allowed to treat her like an exception to the rule book. And that makes everything ahead feel bigger than it did before. So no, this is not just a story about an award. It is a story about what that award seems to confirm. It is a story about why 1 week of international basketball may have said more about the last 2 years of WNBA officiating than all the press conferences, all the post-game complaints, and all the commissioner responses combined. It is a story about exposure, about contrast, about the danger of telling people there is no problem, only to watch the same player walk into another setting and instantly make the problem visible without even having to say it out loud. Because in the end, the most explosive evidence did not come from a rant, a conspiracy theory, or a viral fan clip. It came from the game itself. And once the game starts telling that kind of truth, there is nowhere left to hide. Before that international stage ever exposed anything, The pattern had already been building in plain sight. Not quietly, not subtly. Repeated, visible, and increasingly difficult to explain away. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into the WNBA, the conversation was supposed to be about adjustment, faster pace, stronger defenders, more physical play. That was the expectation. Every rookie hears it. Every star has to deal with it. But what started happening to Clark did not feel like normal adjustment. It felt like something else entirely. Something that kept showing up in the same way, night after night, no matter who the opponent was. Because the contact was not occasional. It was constant. It showed up before she even touched the ball. Hands on her hips. Arms wrapped around her waist. Defenders leaning into her path, slowing her down before the play even started. And then once she did get the ball, it did not stop. It escalated. Bumps on drives. Reaches on every dribble. Bodies stepping into her space without any real attempt to play the ball. And through all of it, the whistle stayed quiet far more often than it should have. At first, people brushed it off. That is just how the league plays. That is playoff-level defense. She needs to get used to it. But then the clips started stacking up. Not one or two moments, but dozens. Then hundreds. The same types of contact. The same lack of calls. The same reactions from Clark, looking toward the officials, waiting for something that never came. And then came the moment everyone remembers. The collision with Chennedy Carter. It was not hidden. Not something you had to analyze frame by frame. It happened right in front of everyone. Off the ball. No attempt to play defense. Just a straight-up body check that sent Clark off balance. The kind of contact that, in most situations, gets called instantly and escalates just as quickly. But this time, there was nothing. No whistle. No escalation. No message sent to the defender. And that moment mattered more than people realized. Because when something that obvious goes unpunished, it changes behavior. It tells defenders exactly how far they can go. It tells them where the line is, or more importantly, where it is not. And once that line disappears, the game shifts. It becomes less about skill and more about how much contact you can get away with. And Carter was not the only one. Throughout the season, players like Alyssa Thomas brought relentless physicality. Contact on catches. Contact on drives. Hands on the body that stayed there longer than they should. The kind of defense that, if called tightly, forces adjustments. But when it is not called, it becomes the default approach. That is when things started to spiral. Because once defenders realized the whistle was inconsistent, they pushed even further. Illegal screens where Clark got grabbed, trying to fight through. Closeouts that stepped into her landing space. Hits to the face that somehow turned into nothing more than a reset of possession. Moments where she would clearly absorb contact, lose balance, and still hear silence instead of a whistle. And every time that happened, it added another layer to the frustration. Not just for Clark, but for anyone watching closely. Because this was not happening evenly across the league. It was not a situation where both teams were dealing with the same level of missed calls. The pattern leaned in one direction. Consistently. And that is what made it feel different from normal officiating mistakes. Mistakes are random. This was not. You could see it in the reactions. Clark would look at the official after absorbing contact, sometimes saying nothing, sometimes visibly frustrated, sometimes just shaking her head and running back on defense. And on the other side, defenders played with a certain confidence. Not just confidence in their ability, but confidence in what they could get away with. That confidence changes everything. Because when a defender knows the whistle is unlikely, they do not hesitate. They do not pull back. They do not worry about foul trouble. They lean in harder. They reach more aggressively. They test the limits on every possession. And when there is no consequence, that style becomes the standard. That is how a pattern becomes a system. And by the time the season moved forward, it was no longer just about isolated plays. It was about an entire style of defense that had formed around Clark. A style built on constant pressure, constant contact, and an understanding that the rules might not be enforced the same way they are for everyone else. There were games where it reached a breaking point. Drives where she got hit multiple times before releasing the ball. Sequences where defenders made contact again and again, and still no whistle came. Moments where the physicality crossed from competitive into something much harder to justify. And through all of it, the explanation stayed the same. Physical league. Tough defense. She will adjust. But there is a difference between adjusting to the game and adjusting to something that is not being called correctly. And that difference is what started to stand out more with every passing week. Because the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. Fans saw it. Analysts started mentioning it. Coaches began hinting at it. Not always directly. Not always loudly. But enough to make it clear that something felt off. And once that feeling sets in, it does not go away. It grows. It turns every new game into another test. Another opportunity to see if the pattern continues. Another chance to watch how defenders approach Clark compared to other players. Another moment where people start paying attention not just to the play, but to the whistle. And more often than not, the result was the same. Silence where there should have been a call. And that silence, repeated over and over again, became the foundation for everything that came next. At some point, patterns stop being arguments and start becoming numbers. Because you can debate clips. You can argue about individual plays. You can slow things down, zoom things in, and still have people disagree about what should or should not have been called. But numbers? Numbers don't care about opinion. Numbers don't react to narratives. Numbers just sit there and force you to deal with what they show. And that is exactly what happened when Stephanie White said it out loud. -31. Not -3. Not -7. Not even -15. -31 free throw attempts across a playoff stretch. 31 more chances at the line for one side than the other. 31 extra opportunities to score uncontested points, to slow the game down, to reset defensively, to control momentum. That is not a normal gap. That is not something you can brush off as a couple of bad calls or one rough officiating night. That is a number that stretches across multiple games, multiple quarters, multiple critical moments. A number that reflects a trend, not a coincidence. And once that number hit the public conversation, it became a lot harder to keep pretending everything was balanced. Because free throws are not random. They come from contact, from drives, from physical play that crosses the line into a foul. And when one team is consistently attacking the rim, consistently putting pressure on the defense, and still ends up on the wrong side of a gap that large, it forces a question that no one really wants to answer. What exactly is being called, and what is being ignored? That is where things started to feel uncomfortable. Because if you go back and watch those games, the style of play does not match the numbers. The Indiana Fever were not just standing around launching threes all game. They were attacking, driving, creating contact, playing inside the paint, doing the exact things that are supposed to generate free throws. And yet, possession after possession, the whistle stayed quiet on one end while it kept showing up on the other. That kind of imbalance changes more than just the scoreboard. It changes how the game is played. When a team realizes they are not getting calls, they start adjusting. Maybe they pull back on drives. Maybe they hesitate before attacking. Maybe they settle for tougher shots instead of risking contact that will not be rewarded. And on the other side, when a team knows they are getting the benefit of the whistle, they play freer, more aggressive, more confident that any contact will work in their favor. That is how officiating shapes outcomes without ever showing up in the final box score the way people expect. Because it is not just about the points from free throws. It is about everything that happens around them. The rhythm of the game, the pacing, the psychological edge, the way players approach each possession, the way defenses position themselves, the way offenses decide whether to attack or pull back. All of that shifts when the whistle is uneven. And -31 is not just uneven. It is extreme. It is the kind of number that forces even neutral observers to stop and look again. To question whether what they are watching lines up with what they are seeing in the stats. To ask whether this is really just coincidence, or something that has been building underneath the surface for a long time. Because here is the part that makes it even more revealing. This was not coming from fans. This was not coming from social media outrage or highlight clips taken out of context. This was coming from a head coach, someone inside the system, someone who sees every possession, every call, every non-call up close. Someone who understands how officiating works at a professional level and does not throw out a number like that lightly. When a coach says -31, they are not guessing. They are pointing at something. And what they were pointing at was impossible to ignore. Because once that number entered the conversation, it connected everything that had been happening on the floor. Every missed call. Every moment of contact that went unpunished. Every time Clark drove into traffic and came away empty-handed despite clear physicality. It all started to form a bigger picture. A picture that suggested this was not just about isolated incidents. It was about consistency, or more accurately, the lack of it. And consistency is what defines officiating quality. Not perfection, not getting every call right. That is impossible. But consistency, that is the standard. Players can adjust to consistency. Coaches can game plan around consistency. Teams can accept tough calls if they know the same standard applies on both ends. But when that consistency disappears, everything else starts to break down. And that is what this number represented. It represented a breakdown in trust. Because once players feel like the whistle is not the same for both sides, frustration builds. It shows up in body language, in reactions, in the way players talk to officials, in the way coaches respond after games. And eventually, it spills into the public conversation, whether the league wants it to or not. That is exactly what happened here. -31 was not just a stat. It was a signal that something about the way these games were being officiated did not match the standard people expected. A signal that the conversations happening quietly behind the scenes were starting to move into the open. A signal that the issue was no longer something that could be dismissed with a quick explanation or a generic response. Because numbers like that do not go away. They stay. They get repeated, revisited, re-examined. They become part of the narrative, whether anyone wants them to or not. And once they are there, they force everyone involved to either address them honestly or try to explain them away. And that is where the story takes its next turn. Because when the league finally responded, it did not calm anything down. It made everything louder. When a number like that hits the public conversation, you expect a strong response. Not a perfect one, not even a complete one, but something that shows awareness. Something that acknowledges the concern. Something that at least makes it feel like the league understands why people are paying attention in the first place. Instead, what came back was simple. From Cathy Engelbert, the message was clear: referees are human. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Of course they are. No one has ever argued that officials are supposed to be perfect. Basketball moves too fast. Too many angles. Too many bodies. Too many split-second decisions. Mistakes happen. They always have. They always will. But that was never the real question. The question was not whether refs are human. The question was whether the same type of mistakes were happening over and over again, in the same direction. Because there is a difference between randomness and repetition. Random mistakes balance out over time. Some go your way. Some go against you. Some nights feel frustrating, others feel fair. That is part of the game. But repetition builds patterns. And patterns are what people had been seeing with Caitlin Clark for 2 straight seasons. That is why the response felt incomplete. It did not address the pattern. It did not address the clips. It did not address the numbers. It did not address the consistency. It just simplified everything down to a general truth that nobody was even arguing against. And once that happens, it sends a message. Not always intentionally, but clearly. It tells players that what they are experiencing might not be taken seriously. It tells fans that what they are seeing might not be acknowledged. It tells coaches that raising concerns might not lead to meaningful change. And it tells referees that, at least publicly, there is no urgent need to adjust anything. That is where things started to shift. Because now the issue was not just about officiating. It was about accountability. And accountability is what defines trust between a league and its audience. If people believe concerns are being heard, they stay patient. If they believe adjustments are being considered, they give the benefit of the doubt. But when the response feels dismissive, even if that is not the intention, patience disappears quickly. That is exactly what happened here. Because while the league was explaining things in broad terms, the footage was still there. The missed calls were still there. The physicality was still there. And now, on top of that, there was a growing sense that the conversation itself was not being handled with the seriousness it deserved. That creates tension. And once tension builds, every new game becomes part of a larger story. Every no call feels heavier. Every questionable whistle gets more attention. Every reaction from Clark becomes more scrutinized. Not just as a moment in isolation, but as part of an ongoing pattern that people are now actively watching for. And here is where it gets even more complicated. Because this was happening at the exact same time the league was experiencing a surge in attention. More eyes, more viewers, more conversations happening outside traditional basketball circles. And with that increased attention comes increased scrutiny. People who might not have followed the WNBA closely before were now watching closely. Not just for highlights, but for everything around them. That includes officiating. And when new viewers enter a space and immediately notice something that longtime fans have already been talking about, it amplifies the issue instantly. Because now it is not just a niche discussion. It becomes a broader narrative. A narrative that starts to follow every game, every highlight, every debate show, every social media clip. And once that narrative forms, it is very difficult to control. That is why the response mattered so much. Not because it had to solve everything overnight, but because it had to match the moment. It had to show that the league understood the scale of the conversation, that it recognized the difference between normal officiating debates and what people were seeing in this specific situation. Instead, it felt like the moment passed without that acknowledgement, and that left a gap between what was happening on the floor and how it was being addressed publicly, a gap between the experience of players and the messaging from leadership, a gap between what fans were seeing and what they were being told. And gaps like that do not stay empty. They get filled with speculation, filled with frustration, filled with theories about why things are happening the way they are. Some of those theories go too far. Some miss the mark. But they all come from the same place, a lack of clarity. Because when people do not feel like they are getting clear answers, they start creating their own. That is when the conversation starts moving in directions the league cannot easily guide. And all of this was building quietly in the background. Game after game, clip after clip, comment after comment. The sense that something was off continued to grow, even as official responses stayed the same. And then, just as that tension reached a point where it felt like it might settle into a permanent debate, something happened that changed everything. Not inside the WNBA. Outside of it. Because the moment Clark stepped into a different environment, under a different standard, with a different whistle, all of those questions that had been building suddenly had something they had been missing the entire time. A comparison. And once that comparison existed, the conversation was no longer theoretical. It became visible. The moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a FIBA court, something felt different. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just clean. The spacing looked clearer. The movement looked smoother. The rhythm of the game felt uninterrupted in a way that had been missing for a long time. And the reason for that difference showed up almost immediately. The whistle was there. Not constantly. Not excessively. But consistently. When there was contact, it was called. When a defender reached in, it was called. When a player stepped into a landing space, it was called. No hesitation. No delay. No second guessing whether the moment was big enough to deserve a whistle. It was just basketball, played by the rules. And that alone changed everything. Because for the first time in a long time, Clark was operating in an environment where defenders had to think twice. They could not just lean into her without consequence. They could not just grab her on cuts. They could not just bump her off balance and recover like nothing happened. Every action came with a risk. And when defenders feel that risk, their behavior changes instantly. They become more disciplined. They give more space. They choose angles more carefully. They hesitate just enough to create an opening. And that small hesitation is all a player like Clark needs. Because her game has never been about brute force. It has always been about timing, about vision, about reading defenses before they fully form, about turning tiny windows into real opportunities. And when those windows are not constantly being closed by uncalled contact, everything starts to expand. Passing lanes open up. Driving lanes become real instead of theoretical. Screens actually function the way they are designed to. The pace of the game increases because the ball is not getting stuck in constant physical battles. And suddenly, the entire offense starts to breathe. That is what people noticed right away. Not just the stats. Not just the highlights. The flow. Because the flow told the real story. There were no long stretches of players arguing with officials. No repeated sequences where everyone stopped to question what just happened. No constant feeling that something obvious had been missed. The referees were not invisible, but they were not becoming the focus either. They were doing their job, and then getting out of the way. And that is when the contrast became impossible to ignore. Because fans who had spent the last 2 years watching games where officiating was a constant topic suddenly found themselves watching games where it barely came up at all. No endless debates. No viral complaints. No post-game frustration dominating the conversation. That silence said more than any argument ever could. Because when officiating is working the way it is supposed to, people stop talking about it. They talk about the players. And that is exactly what happened here. The focus shifted entirely to Clark, to her decisions, to her creativity, to the way she controlled possessions without looking rushed, to the way she manipulated defenders who could no longer rely on unchecked physicality to slow her down. And here is the most important part. FIBA referees did not give her anything extra. They did not protect her beyond the rules. They did not create advantages for her. They simply enforced what was already written. That is what made it so revealing. Because this was not about favoritism. It was about consistency. The same rules that exist in the WNBA rulebook were being applied here without hesitation. Contact on the ball handler, foul. Illegal screen, foul. Reaching across the body, foul. Simple, direct, no gray area. And once those rules were enforced properly, the entire structure of the game shifted. Defenders could not cheat the system anymore. They could not rely on officials swallowing the whistle. They had to play straight up. And when that happened, Clark did not just look comfortable. She looked in control. There is a difference between surviving a game and controlling it. In the WNBA, too many possessions felt like survival. Fighting through contact, absorbing hits, trying to create despite resistance that never seemed to get acknowledged. But here, in this environment, the game slowed down for her. Not because the pace was slower, because the chaos was gone. And once that chaos disappeared, everything else became clearer. Her reads became sharper. Her passes arrived earlier. Her decision-making looked effortless. Her confidence expanded with every possession. And that is when people started asking the question they had been avoiding before. If this is what she looks like under consistent officiating, then what exactly have we been watching for the last 2 years? Because the difference was not small. It was structural. It was the difference between a player being constantly disrupted and a player being allowed to operate within the natural flow of the game. And once you see that difference play out in real time, it is impossible to ignore how much impact officiating actually has on performance. That is what made this moment so powerful. Not because Clark suddenly became better overnight, but because the environment around her finally matched the way the game is supposed to be played. And once that happened, the results were not just impressive. They were historic. Because when you take a player who has already been producing under pressure, under contact, under inconsistency, and you remove those barriers, what you get is not just improvement. You get an explosion. And that explosion is what came next. And this is where everything flipped. Because once Caitlin Clark stepped into that environment where the rules were actually being enforced, the conversation stopped being theoretical. It became measurable. It became undeniable. It became historic. The numbers didn't just improve. They exploded. 5 records in a single game. 14 across the tournament. Youngest MVP in the history of the competition. And those numbers weren't empty. They weren't inflated by garbage time or soft matchups. They were built possession by possession, decision by decision, in a setting where every action finally had consequences for both sides. That's what made it so revealing. Because nothing about Clark's skill set changed. Her shooting didn't suddenly appear. Her vision didn't suddenly develop. Her passing creativity didn't magically evolve overnight. All of that was already there. The only thing that changed was the environment. And once that environment changed, everything unlocked. The floor looked wider. Not physically, but functionally. Because defenders could no longer close space illegally. They couldn't just body her off her line. They couldn't grab her before she turned the corner. That extra half-step of freedom created passing angles that simply didn't exist before. And Clark thrives in those margins. She doesn't need a full lane. She needs a window. And now those windows were everywhere. That's why the assists jumped. Not just in volume, but in quality. Passes that hit cutters in stride. Skip passes that punished help defenders instantly. Transition reads that turned into easy points before the defense even had time to react. The offense wasn't just working. It was flowing in a way that made everything look faster, cleaner, and more controlled. And then there was the scoring. Because once defenders couldn't crowd her with unchecked contact, her shot became even more dangerous. They had to respect her space. They had to close out properly. They had to think before stepping too far into her body. That hesitation matters, even a split second. Because for a shooter like Clark, that's enough time to rise, release, and punish the defense. That's how you get performances that feel almost unreal. Deep threes that look effortless. Pull-ups that come out of nowhere. Sequences where the defense does everything right and still can't stop the outcome. And all of it ties back to one simple factor: freedom of movement. That's the phrase that defines everything here. Because basketball, at its highest level, is about rhythm. It's about timing. It's about reading space and reacting to it. And when that rhythm is constantly disrupted by uncalled contact, the entire game slows down in the worst way. It becomes choppy, forced, unnatural. But when that disruption disappears, when the game is allowed to flow the way it's designed to, everything speeds up. Not just physically, but mentally. And that's where Clark separates herself. Because once she's operating at that speed, defenses don't just struggle. They break. They overcommit. They rotate late. They lose track of assignments. And once that happens, she's already one step ahead. That's why those records matter. Not because they look impressive on paper, but because they show what happens when a player like her is given a fair environment. This wasn't about getting extra calls. This wasn't about favoritism. This wasn't about referees helping her dominate. It was the opposite. It was about referees removing the barriers that had been holding her back. That's the distinction people need to understand. Because there's a big difference between being given an advantage and having a disadvantage taken away. FIBA didn't give Clark anything. They stopped taking things away. And once that happened, the gap between what she had been doing and what she was capable of doing became impossible to ignore. That's why the impact felt so immediate. Because it exposed something deeper than just performance. It exposed the relationship between officiating and outcomes. It showed how much of the game is shaped not just by players, but by how the game is called. And once that connection becomes clear, it forces a completely different way of looking at everything that came before. Because now you can't just say, she struggled in certain moments. Now you have to ask, under what conditions? Now you can't just say, that's how the league plays. Now you have to ask, should it be? And most importantly, now you can't ignore the possibility that what people thought was a limitation was actually a restriction. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Because if Clark can produce at this level when the game is called correctly, then every previous evaluation of her performance has to be reconsidered. Every game, every stat line, every narrative, all of it. And that's what makes this so much bigger than just one tournament. Because this wasn't just a breakout. It was a reveal. A reveal of what happens when the game stops working against her. And once that version of Clark is out there, once people have seen it with their own eyes, there's no going back to the old conversation. Because now everyone knows what's possible. And that changes everything moving forward. But just when everything started to look unstoppable, the game pushed back. Because domination in basketball never exists in a vacuum. The moment one player starts controlling everything, opponents adjust. They study. They experiment. They try to take that control away. And that's exactly what happened against Puerto Rico. They didn't try to outplay Caitlin Clark. They tried to erase her. A box and one. One defender glued to her every step. No space. No breathing room. No easy catches. For players behind in zone, ready to collapse on anything that slipped through. It's not a defense you run by accident. It's a defense you choose when one player is the entire problem. And in theory, it makes sense. Take the ball out of her hands. Force someone else to beat you. Break the rhythm before it ever starts. But here's where things got complicated. Because the defense wasn't the only thing limiting Clark in that game. The system was too. Instead of leaning into what had just worked, letting her control the offense, letting her read the defense, letting her manipulate the floor, her role shifted. Less ball in hand. More off-ball movement. Fewer direct decisions. And the effect was immediate. The offense slowed down. The spacing tightened. The flow that had looked so natural in earlier games suddenly felt forced. Not broken, but uncomfortable. Because when you take a player who just showed she can bend the entire defense to her will, and then reduce her involvement, you don't just limit her. You limit everything around her. That's what made this moment so revealing. Because now there were two forces working at the same time. Puerto Rico's defense trying to remove her impact, and Team USA's system not fully adjusting to counter it. And when those two things combine, even a player like Clark can look less dominant. But here's the key difference from what people had seen in the WNBA. Even with all of that, the officiating stayed consistent. When defenders made contact, it was called. When they reached, it was called. When they stepped out of line, the whistle came. The physicality never crossed into chaos. That's what kept the game from turning into the kind of situation Clark had dealt with before. Because in the WNBA, a scheme like that often turns into something else entirely. It turns into constant grabbing, constant bumping, constant disruption that never gets penalized. And once that happens, the defense doesn't just limit a player. It overwhelms them. But here, that didn't happen. The defense was aggressive. It was focused. It was designed specifically to stop her. But it still had to follow the rules. And that changed everything. Because even when her touches were limited, the structure of the game stayed intact. The spacing was still there. The options still existed. The offense still had a chance to function. It just needed the right adjustments. And that's where the shift came. When Nate Tibbetts adjusted the lineup and put Clark back into her natural role, primary ball handler, controlling tempo, reading the defense, everything snapped back into place. Suddenly, the same defense that had looked effective started breaking down. Because a box-and-one only works if the player being targeted is removed from decision-making. The moment Clark regained that control, the entire structure collapsed. The defender chasing her created space somewhere else. The zone behind had to stretch. Rotations got slower. Passing lanes reopened. And just like that, the offense started flowing again. That's the difference between limiting a player and misusing them. Puerto Rico's defense limited her. The system, at first, misused her. And once that was corrected, the gap became obvious. Because no scheme can fully stop a player who understands how to manipulate it. And Clark doesn't just react to defenses. She reads them. She anticipates them. She uses them against themselves. That's why giving her control matters so much. Because the more decisions she makes, the more pressure she puts on every defender on the floor. And once that pressure builds, something always gives. That's what this game revealed. Not just that Clark can dominate under fair officiating, but that even when teams throw everything at her, specialized defenses, constant attention, strategic adjustments, the real key isn't stopping her. It's how she's used. Because if she's fully involved, fully trusted, fully allowed to operate, the game tilts in her favor no matter what the defense tries. And that realization doesn't just affect one game. It affects everything moving forward. Because now the blueprint is clear. Not just for opponents, but for her own team. And once that blueprint is understood, there's no going back to anything else. And just when the performance made everything look undeniable, the tone around it started to shift. Not on the court, off it. Because while Caitlin Clark was leading the tournament, breaking records, and clearly driving the entire offense whenever she had control, a different kind of conversation started to surface. Not about her production, not about the results, about her reactions, about how she carried herself, about how much attention she was getting. And the timing of that shift mattered. Because this wasn't happening when she struggled. It wasn't happening during a quiet stretch or a difficult performance. It was happening at the exact moment she was proving, in the clearest way possible, what she looks like under consistent officiating. That's what made it feel intentional. Because when criticism shows up during peak success, it stops feeling like analysis. It starts feeling like something else. Voices like Angel McCautry began suggesting that Clark needed to tone things down, that she should react differently to calls, that she should shrug things off more, stay calmer, be less expressive in moments where she clearly felt contact wasn't being called the way it should. And on the surface, that advice sounds reasonable. Stay composed. Stay focused. Don't let officiating affect your mindset. But context changes everything. Because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was happening after 2 years of visible patterns. After countless possessions where frustration didn't come from nowhere, but from repetition. After an entire stretch where the difference between what was happening and what was being called had already been questioned over and over again. So when that kind of advice shows up right as she's dominating, it raises a different kind of question. Why now? Why in this moment? Because if the concern was truly about composure, it could have been raised at any point. But instead, it appeared right when Clark's performance was reaching a level that was impossible to ignore. And that's where the tension starts to build. Because this isn't just about one player. It's about attention. It's about spotlight. It's about what happens when one player's impact starts to shift the entire conversation around a league, around a team, around a sport. Because Clark wasn't just playing well. She was becoming the center of everything. The focus of the tournament. The name in every headline. The The player that even opposing environments couldn't ignore. There were moments where that reality showed up in the smallest details. Fans in the stands holding signs with her face on them, even when their own team was on the floor. Opposing narratives being pulled toward her, whether intentionally or not. The kind of presence you can't manufacture. And that kind of presence changes dynamics. Not just externally, but internally. Because when one player starts pulling that much attention, it creates pressure. Pressure on teammates. Pressure on coaches. Pressure on veterans who have been part of the system long before this shift started happening. And sometimes, that pressure doesn't show up as direct criticism. It shows up subtly. In comments about balance. In conversations about making sure everyone shines. In suggestions that things should be spread out more evenly. Which, again, sounds reasonable. Until you look at the context. Because when a player just broke 5 records in a single game, and the immediate response is to talk about limiting how much they shine, it creates a contradiction that's hard to ignore. It suggests a tension between performance and control, between what's working and what's comfortable, and that tension showed up in the system itself. Moments where Clark's role was reduced. Moments where the offense shifted away from her, even when she had already proven she could carry it. Moments where the focus seemed to move toward balance instead of maximizing the most effective option on the floor. And that's where things become complicated. Because basketball, at its core, is simple. You lean into what works. You build around your most effective player. You create systems that amplify strengths, not limit them. But when other factors come into play, attention, perception, internal dynamics, that simplicity can get lost. And that's what this moment hinted at. That even when everything points in one direction, there can still be resistance. Not loud, not obvious, but present. And that's what makes Clark's response so important. Because instead of feeding into that tension, she went the opposite way. She didn't push back publicly. She didn't turn it into a conflict. She didn't make it about herself. She kept it focused on the team, on execution, on defense, on improving collectively, which, in a way, made the contrast even sharper. Because while others were talking about her reactions, she was talking about how the team could get better. While others were questioning her approach, she was delivering results. And that's what kept the focus grounded. Because at the end of the day, performance has a way of cutting through everything else. It doesn't eliminate the tension, but it makes it harder to ignore what's actually happening on the floor. And what was happening on the floor was clear. The team was better when Clark was fully involved. The offense was sharper. The pace was faster. The decision-making was cleaner. The results were stronger. Not slightly, noticeably. And that's what makes this moment so important moving forward. Because now the conversation isn't just about whether Clark can dominate. That part has already been answered. Now it's about what happens when everything around her fully accepts that reality. Because once that happens, there's no limit to how far this can go. Now everything shifts forward. Because after everything that just happened, after the contrast, the records, the officiating differences, and the conversations that followed, the next step is unavoidable. What happens next? Because Caitlin Clark isn't staying in that international environment. She's coming back. Back to the WNBA. Back to the same teams. Back to the same defenders. And most importantly, back to the same officiating system that's now under a completely different level of scrutiny. And that's what makes 2026 feel different. Not because Clark suddenly became a better player, but because now everyone has seen what she looks like when the game is called the right way. That changes expectations. For fans, for coaches, for players, for referees. Because now, every possession is going to be watched through a different lens. Every drive, every bump, every off-ball grab, every no-call. It's all going to be compared to what people just saw on that international stage. And that kind of comparison creates pressure. Real pressure. Because before, there was always uncertainty. Maybe it's just physical play. Maybe it's just how the league works. Maybe it's just part of the adjustment. But now, there's a reference point. A clear one. And once that exists, it becomes impossible to hide behind general explanations. Now it's specific. Now it's visible. Now it's measurable. And that puts the spotlight directly on officiating in a way it hasn't been before. But that's only part of the story. Because while all of that is happening, Clark is also returning to a team that's no longer trying to figure itself out. The Indiana Fever aren't rebuilding anymore. They're ready. With players like Aaliyah Boston anchoring the inside and Kelsey Mitchell providing scoring on the perimeter, the foundation is already there. And now, they're adding back the most important piece. A healthy Clark. A Clark who just came off a stretch where she controlled games at a level that forced the entire basketball world to pay attention again. A Clark who now understands, more clearly than ever, what the game looks like when it's played under consistent rules. And that combination is dangerous. Because when you take a player who already sees the game differently, and you add confidence built from proof, not belief, not potential, but proof, everything sharpens. Decision-making gets faster. Reads get cleaner. Aggression becomes more calculated. And most importantly, expectations rise. Not just from the outside, from within. Because now she knows. She knows what's possible when the environment isn't working against her. And that changes how she approaches everything. But here's where it gets even bigger. Because this isn't just about Clark anymore. It's about the league. Because the WNBA is now in a position where it can't afford for this conversation to keep growing the way it has. Not with more eyes on the game. Not with rising viewership. Not with increasing attention from media, fans, and sponsors. Because once officiating becomes part of the headline, it starts to overshadow everything else. And that's the last thing any league wants. So now there are only two paths forward. Either the officiating standard tightens. Consistency improves. The whistle matches what fans just saw internationally. And the conversation fades away naturally. Or, it doesn't. And if it doesn't, every single game becomes a continuation of this story. Every missed call becomes another clip. Every questionable sequence becomes another debate. And every strong performance from Clark becomes another reminder of what she looks like when things are called differently. That's the risk. Because the comparison isn't going anywhere. And neither is she. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Because everything we've just seen, everything that's been exposed, everything that's now impossible to ignore, it all leads to one simple idea. If the game is called fairly, if the whistle is consistent, if the environment matches the rules that are supposed to exist, what does a full WNBA season from Caitlin Clark actually look like? Because if this tournament showed anything, it's that the gap between great and unstoppable might be smaller than anyone expected. And that gap, it might not depend on her at all. At this point, the story isn't complicated anymore. The comparison is there. The evidence is there. The difference is clear. The same player, under two different standards, produced two completely different realities. And once that kind of contrast exists, it forces a question that no one can keep avoiding. What have we actually been watching? Because for 2 years, the narrative around Caitlin Clark was shaped by an environment that now looks questionable at best. Every evaluation, every debate, every criticism was built on the assumption that the game around her was fair, that the rules were being applied the same way for everyone, that what she was dealing with was simply part of the league. But now that assumption doesn't hold the same weight, because we've seen the alternative. We've seen what happens when the game is called cleanly, when contact is actually penalized, when defenders have to respect the rules instead of testing how far they can bend them. And in that environment, Clark didn't just succeed. She dominated. She controlled the pace. She broke records. She became the youngest MVP in that setting's history. And most importantly, she did it without needing anything extra. No special treatment. No favorable whistle. No advantage beyond what the rulebook already allows. That's what makes this so important. Because it flips the entire conversation. It forces people to reconsider everything that came before. Every moment where she looked frustrated. Every game where her efficiency dipped. Every stretch where the narrative started to shift against her. Now those moments have context. Now they have an explanation that can't just be dismissed. And once that context exists, it changes how everything moving forward will be judged. Because from this point on, every WNBA game comes with a built-in comparison. Every possession is being watched differently. Every whistle, or lack of one, carries more weight. And every performance from Clark will be measured against what people now know she's capable of under consistent officiating. That's not pressure on her. That's pressure on the system around her. Because now the responsibility shifts. It's no longer about whether she can prove herself. She already has. Now it's about whether the league can match the standard that was just put on display. Because if it does, if the officiating tightens, if the consistency improves, if the game starts to look the way it's supposed to look, then we're about to see something completely different. Not just a great player having a strong season, but a player operating at a level that forces the entire league to adjust around her. A player who doesn't just influence games, but reshapes them. And if that happens, the MVP conversation in 2026 won't even feel like a debate. It'll feel inevitable. But if nothing changes, if the same patterns show up again, if the same inconsistencies continue, then this story doesn't end here. It gets louder, because now people know what to look for. And once the audience understands the difference, there's no going back to ignoring it. That's what makes this moment so critical. It's not just about what Clark did. It's about what was revealed, about the gap between perception and reality, about the difference between performance and environment, and about how quickly everything can change when that environment shifts. So now it comes down to one final question. Not about the past, not even about this tournament, but about what comes next. If Caitlin Clark is given a full season where the game is called the way it's supposed to be called, what exactly is the rest of the league supposed to do about it? And before you go, here's something important. If you're into deep breakdowns like this, not just highlights, but the real stories behind what's happening in the WNBA, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. Because this isn't surface-level content. We break down patterns, trends, and hidden details that most people miss. So hit the like button if you made it this far, drop your thoughts in the comments, especially on whether you think officiating will actually change, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this story, it's just getting started.